All right, good afternoon. Why don't we get started? My name's Doug Irwin. I'm a professor in the economics department and co-director of the Political Economy Project. And on behalf of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy, it's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon. Before we get started, I just had three quick announcements, two of which have to do with future events. Next week, I just want to flag for you on Monday at 4 to 5 p.m. in Rocky 1, we have Russ Muirhead speaking about his new book, which has just been published, called Ungoverning: The Attack on the Administrative State and the Politics of Chaos. Possibly very relevant for coming years, but there will be free copies for students. The first 20 students that come will get a free copy. He'll speak about his book, and once again, that is from 4 to 5 on Monday in Rocky 1. Second event that I would like to announce is next Thursday, 1 week from right now, we will have Harry Enton, class of 2011, Dartmouth grad, who is the senior political data reporter and host of CNN's Margins of Error. If you were watching the election on CNN, you saw him quite a bit. He knows the data on the election inside and out, and he will be here next Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. in Low Auditorium. So once again, if you're interested in sort of the deep dive on the data, that would be fantastic. Last announcement is, as you know, there's been an incredibly busy term. The Rockefeller Center has put on an amazing array of events. The staff has been incredibly busy. So I think we owe it a round of applause to Devorah Greenberg-Culling and Madison Peel for helping put together so much over this past quarter. So thank you both for an amazing program and so much work. So it's actually a delight and an honor to introduce to you our speaker today, Matt Yglesias. The timing of his visit is perfect. It was set well in advance. He chose the date, and it turns out to be very propitious for various reasons. He is a true entrepreneur in the journalism media space. He's the founder and author of Slow Boring, which I thought was slow and boring, but no, it's a reference to Max Weber. So it's a leading subscription newsletter on American public policy that consistently ranks in Substack's Politics Top 10 list. He's a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, the co-host of the Grid's podcast Bad Takes, and the author of several books, the most recent of which is 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger. Before launching the newsletter, he was co-founder of Vox.com with Ezra Klein and Melissa Bell. Served as editor, number 2 editor in that publication. He's also written the Money Box column for Slate, has contributed to the American Prospect, the Atlantic, and Think Progress. He has written extensively on the intersection between politics and economic policy. And the title for his talk today is The Strange Death of American Neoliberalism, which will lead into a discussion of the election. So, welcome to Dartmouth, Matt Yglesias.
See, you're not getting any of my clever references. It's supposed to be The Strange Death of Neoliberal America. It's a book about England. Anyway, doesn't matter. Sorry. So, you know, I try to give good talks when I talk. Unfortunately, this was a challenging situation because there was a presidential election recently, as it happens. And so it was a little hard to know what to say about the trajectory of American politics until I knew what actually happened in the election. And then I've been busy since then. Here, visiting classes, et cetera, so I'm a little bit disorganized, but I still think that it is a propitious moment to talk about this. Something that happens after every presidential election is the party that loses thinks about why did it lose and what can we learn from this loss. And after the 2016 presidential election, the Democratic Party decided that the economic model that it had run with under Barack Obama and under Bill Clinton, economic policy model, was bad, that it had failed, that the fact that people were voting for Trump, and in particular that white working class people had voted for Trump, showed that there had been some profound failure of economic policy management. And the decision was that the old bad policy was something called neoliberalism, and that neoliberalism had to do with the kind of agreement to center markets and free trade as part of the economic policy paradigm. And we can look back, we can reconstruct. There clearly was this kind of neoliberal era in American politics that really starts with Jimmy Carter. He does the Airline Deregulation Act, he does the Motor Carrier Deregulation Act. I forget the name of the natural gas law, but it passes there. It was a move to get the government out of the business of regulating prices. Bill Clinton very much follows this, so does Barack Obama. We have a lot of disagreements about economic policy in this era. There are disagreements about tax rates, there are disagreements about the size and scope of the welfare state, there are disagreements about regulation of pollution externalities, disagreements about regulation for consumer protection against asymmetrical information. And this all reflects, if any of you are economics students or faculty, this is like the stuff that's in mainstream economics textbooks, right? That, this is markets, we have market failures, we try to have narrowly tailored corrections for them. I don't think there's any factual basis to the idea that people voted for Donald Trump in 2016 because this economic model had failed in some sudden way. There were obviously economic problems in the United States of America during Barack Obama's presidency. There are always problems in the world. But the unemployment rate was steadily falling. The incumbent president at the time of the election, Obama, was quite popular. He was doing well. People liked him. If he had been able to run for a third term, he would have won quite easily. And I think that electoral defeat, it was very narrow, so you can attribute it to anything that you want in the universe, right? If Jim Comey does a different letter, Hillary wins. Probably if Hillary hadn't voted for the Iraq War, she wins, et cetera. But macro-politically, what was happening in the country in 2016 is that starting in 2014 and then 2015, the Democratic Party embraced some new left-wing ideas on immigration and criminal justice policy in particular. On immigration, there was a failure of a legislative compromise that would have paired border security with a path to citizenship for undocumented citizens. The Obama administration moved to just sort of step away from immigration enforcement on a unilateral basis as a result of that failure. At the time they did that, it was universally understood by Democrats to be a big political risk. The senators who were up in cycle in 2014 didn't want him to do it because they thought it was too politically risky. So he didn't. He waited until the midterms. Then Democrats did very poorly in the midterms, and then they went forward with it anyway, which was really controversial at the time. If you look up, I wrote about it, but not just me. My colleague Ezra Klein wrote columns hand-wringing about Obama's decision to do this in The Atlantic. Everywhere was covered. Very controversial, very risky. We had the protests in Ferguson, Missouri at around the same time, which put on the table, there'd been long percolation of this kind of criminal justice reform agenda, but mainstream Democratic Party politicians before those protests never in a million years would have said that we need to make police officers be nicer to the people that they're arresting. And it was striking at the time in particular that, Michael Brown was not a totally random, innocent person. And there was a lot of debate about that at the time. And the progressive stance, I was working at Vox, and my colleagues put these articles, and they were like, there's no such thing as a perfect victim. We don't need to be doing respectability politics about this. Everybody has rights. And I agreed. But it was politically risky. And there were articles at the time about the risk that was involved in this. And they said that, Democrats no longer needed to rely on the votes of culturally conservative white working class people, that there had been enough demographic change in the country that these new era of progressive possibilities were around. I think what we found in 2016 is that that's not true. It was not accurate. And I remember because, you always remember the things that you get right. That people complain about at the time. And I remember being in my office in 2012 after Obama won re-election. And right away, his people, they're doing briefings, they're putting out why we won, how we won. And they're talking about immigration and the impact of the Latino vote on the election outcome. And they're saying Mitt Romney and his self-deportation stuff, it just killed him. Republicans are gonna have to change their stance on this. And I'm sitting there, I'm on the phone, I'm looking at the map, I'm looking at Obama winning Iowa, and I'm squinting at him did the Latino vote win Iowa for Obama? Did it win Wisconsin? Like, what are we talking about here? Like, how did this happen? But they were all saying it, you know? So I kind of wrote it up too, but I was like, I don't really think this makes sense. You look back, why did they say that, right? Why did they place so much spin on this? Well, the reason was a president wants to have achievements in his second term. It's hard to do things in your second term because you've already done most of the low-hanging fruit. He had a Republican Congress to deal with. So what could he possibly reach a bipartisan agreement with Republicans on? Well, at that time, there was some significant Republican support for immigration reform, and Republicans had lost the election. They needed to do something in terms of repositioning. The donor class of the Republican Party was very committed to low taxes, welfare state rollback, and so what they put forward was the idea that maybe we should compromise more on immigration. And the Obama administration wanted to encourage them to compromise more on immigration. So they really overplayed the idea that immigration was what was killing Republicans. Republican donor elites also liked that idea. And a bipartisan compromise almost happened. I mean, people forget, but there was a Gang of 8 immigration reform bill. It got 70 votes in the Senate. It had majority support in the House, but it didn't come to the floor because of party cartel dynamics. And it was killed. And that's the central moment of Trump to me, is, you know, the Republican base didn't want to make that trade. They wanted to make the compromise that Trump ultimately made, which was you move to the center on Medicare. Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney had wanted to privatize Medicare. Trump abandoned that position and said, no, we're going to stay right-wing on immigration, but we're going to move to the center on Medicare. That's what the Republican base wanted. It's why they chose him in 2016. And it was central to his general election victory. You know, if he had espoused Mitt Romney's policy platform that year, he would have lost. But so then Democrats were faced with how to respond to this loss and what to do about it. And I think the obvious thing to do would have been to try to move back to the center on some of these social and cultural issues, particularly related to immigration, crime, law enforcement, these kind of things. If you want to understand how a state like Iowa swings to the right, how a state like Wisconsin swings to the right, it clearly has to do with those topics. But there's a lot of internal pressure inside the political party to not do that, right? Nobody likes to compromise on anything ever. And so this idea, because free trade had never been popular with labor unions, the general idea of accepting markets and prices never really sat all that well with kind of leftist intellectuals who think they should run everything. And so there was this meme that, like, no, secretly we can do better, not by compromising, but by becoming even more left-wing. And it's like crazy. It doesn't make any sense on its face. But you squint at the map, you look at which states Hillary lost, and well, it's Michigan, it's Pennsylvania, it's Wisconsin. And it's true that at least if you ignore Wisconsin, those are states that are very exposed to import competition and where protectionism is kind of locally powerful there. There was this one paper about the China shock and, you know, how it led to a lot of job losses in Ohio. So people were very impressed with that. There's all kinds of other data, right? You can say, well, what about non-college white voters in areas that aren't exposed to trade at all, right? So you look at Staten Island in New York City, where it's just like all the cops and firemen live there. So they've got no imports. They swung really heavily to Trump, right? Because it's like the same people, and they have the same ideas about the world, and they have the same kind of conservative cultural politics. But Democrats ignore this kind of stuff. And there was a big program that hasn't been discussed enough, but the Hewlett Foundation, based out in California, launches a grant program to imagine a post-neoliberal economic order. The Roosevelt Institute in DC, in part with their money, in part with other money, they also put this out. And they say, well, we're going to have the post-neoliberal intellectual and economic order. The people doing this work, you know, not every idea that they come up with is crazy. There's a lot of things that you can do in here. But the basic blueprint concept was we can stop listening to economics, stop doing real economic reasoning, and in particular can stop acknowledging the existence of any kind of trade-offs about anything. So we're going to do protectionism, which all presidents have always selectively done trade protection for political reasons. But the difference is that they knew what they were doing and why, right? That they were making sort of narrow giveaways to narrow interests to gain those people's support. Joe Biden came in and he did a lot of different things in his administration, but one of the things he did was form an administration that was uniquely uninformed by the views and ideas of normal mainstream economists and economic policy thinking. And you saw that really clearly on trade, where he not only, he kept all of Trump's tariffs in place, he put some new stuff of his own in. He, in climate policy, changed the cost-benefit analysis scrutiny so that things could pass muster that didn't clear normal cost-benefit analysis. He talked all the time about how he was the most pro-union president of all time, which is true. He did lots of small-bore union-friendly things with, for example, Davis-Bacon regulations, all kinds of stuff like that. All throughout the government, he sort of empowered regulators to go pedal to the metal, full speed ahead on almost every kind of topic that they could think. And the premise of all of this was that it was supposed to lead non-college voters, and particularly non-college white voters, to re-embrace the Democratic Party, and it completely failed. It's not just that he didn't get those votes back, but by the end of his term, there was panic. Is he going to be able to get the endorsement of blue-collar labor unions? He couldn't get the Teamsters endorsement. He struggled, or rather, it became Kamala Harris, and she started to struggle with a lot of these blue-collar unions who had been better served by the Biden administration than by anybody else in history. And, you can ask the question, why? Why didn't union members love him? Why didn't non-union working class people love this? Well, why would they? But even the union members, early in Biden's term, I was in Pennsylvania. I talked to a guy, with the steelworkers up there. And he, I think, laid it out for me perfectly well, which is he said, look, if they want my advice on how they can win my members' votes, I would say they have to become more conservative on guns, more conservative on immigration, and more conservative on LGBT issues. But they're not asking me for my advice. What they're doing is they're offering me concessions to my labor union on labor policy issues. I'm a union executive. I'm not going to say no to that. So I'm going to do it, but I don't think it's going to work. And he was right, So we wound up with a model that both failed in its proximate political objective to secure more working class support, but also failed as an economic policy model. We had, the Biden economy is much better than Donald Trump paints it to be. It's much better than the most hysterical people in conservative media say it is. That's kind of the nature of modern polarized political debate, is that the opponents are always being wild and over the top. But it's factually true that we had a lot more inflation under Biden than we had in any sort of previous administration. And that's exactly what, if you asked economists, what's going to happen if you run a very large budget deficit, if you pair that with trade protection, if you pair it with a lot of regulatory activism that's indifferent to cost-benefit analysis, if you don't pay any attention to economists and economics, it's you're going to get inflation, and then you're going to cure the inflation with monetary policy that gives you high interest rates, and people are going to be mad about it. And I think it is striking and shocking, now that we know how the election turned out, that at no point during this 4-year span did Biden ever pivot. There was no time when a memo went out from the White House to all agencies saying, guys, whatever you're working on, if it's going to raise prices, stop. Ask everyone on your team, do we have any ideas that will bring prices down? Let's go do those ideas. They didn't do it. When Kamala Harris was given the opportunity to say, what do you disagree with Joe Biden about? She had nothing to say. And, I understand what was behind her strategy there. I mean, I talked to her people on the campaign. I see what they were saying. But, you know, now that the votes are in and you see this very uniform swing to the right across the whole geography, I think it's clear, you know, people were very upset about the outcomes of this economic policy that was devised for electoral reasons and completely failed. And what's really crazy is that the time should be right for Republicans to come in and sort of like reinvigorate free markets, to have the kind of inflation backlash that you saw in the 1970s, where people are going to come in and sort of restore economic orthodoxy. But Trump isn't talking about that at all. He's coming back with a playbook of even higher trade barriers, of deliberately shrinking the workforce through mass deportation. You know, who knows what he thinks on a million other topics, but this is somebody who, for a Republican, is like strikingly hostile to the basic concepts of free markets and things like that. And we're now going to have a debate inside the Democratic Party of sort of what lessons to take and things from this. And, you know, I'll participate in that debate. Lots of people will. But one faction, we saw a very strong statement from Bernie Sanders across the river, and he said that the lesson of this is that Democrats have abandoned the working class and we need even more left-wing economic policy. I don't think that makes any kind of sense as an economic policy, and it's driven by, I'd say, ongoing denialism about the really sort of bleeding obvious fact, which is that non-college people, increasingly of all races, just don't agree with progressive cultural politics, really. And if you want to get those votes, you need to meet people where they are on these kinds of issues. And then if you want to run the economy, there's a lot of technical questions in economic policy, and you need to listen to the people who are well informed about them and make these decisions. And you know what they tell you, a guy who used to run Council of Economic Advisors, you know, he said, look, none of my good ideas ever get implemented. Nobody cares. But what I do in this job is I manage to stop some really bad ideas from getting implemented. And that's the sort of traditional role of economic expertise in the political system, is to be the skunk at the party who tells other people, like, I get it, you're excited about this, but like there's gonna be a lot of downsides. There's some sharp trade-offs, Mr. President, like you gotta think about that. And the Biden administration just took that kind of stuff out of the loop completely. And so I really hope, I mean, I wrote about the strange death of neoliberal America, but I do hope that it will make some kind of comeback and that we can see the need to sort of return to good sense in these kind of policy environments and, you know, address questions of democracy, social division, et cetera, through like the normal politics of saying things that people agree with, and then run economic policy on the basis of workable ideas that create a prosperous country, and just go back and revisit the whole premise that some kind of huge economic calamity has been unfolding over the past 10 years. We had COVID, that was a big calamity, but not of economic policy. But we've been living through, you know, a broad time of more or less prosperous economics, but we keep having politicians trying to derail it for really very little good reason. So I don't know, that's what I gotta say. I imagine people have a lot of questions about this and maybe other things that are going on in the country. I'm a generalist, so you know, happy to field any kind of topics, but I thought I should talk about something concrete here. So that's what I got.
So we want to open it up to questions, particularly from students. I'll just start with one quick one to open. You had a Substack post in late spring saying why Joe Biden lost. Of course, Joe Biden didn't lose because he didn't run, but you were basically correct. Is it the story that you just told, basically your thoughts 6 months ago before the election, that the cake was baked, the Democrats couldn't win?
You know, I didn't want to say the Democrats couldn't win, but I thought that they would probably lose. And you know, anytime an election happens, the job of people with my job is to come back and say, this outcome proves we were right all along. But it's very disingenuous, and so I wanted to bring a little bit more, you know, epistemological rigor to this and kind of pre-register a take on what happened. At the time, I was being controversial because I didn't say that Joe Biden was going to lose because he was too old, which I thought that Biden would lose, and I thought that people would say, well, he lost because he was too old, and I wanted to put this other idea out there. They switched candidates, so Kamala Harris is not that old, and she cannot, I think, have lost due to reasons of age. So, you know, the argument that I put forward in that piece, very similar to the one I put there, is that, yeah, that the Biden administration tried to address people's concerns about the excesses of left-wing cultural politics by doing a very sloppy and unprincipled economic policy, and that then as the problems with that economic policy mounted, you know, they started talking about price controls, they started talking about I guess like gouging is how we wound up kind of parking the ship. But I mean, at one point, the Biden administration put out an initiative for nationwide rent control. And, you know, I remember I was on the phone with the briefers on this, and it's like, you could tell by how that policy was crafted that it had been edited by people who knew it was a bad idea. You know, because it had like 7 caveats to it where they were like trying to say it wasn't going to crimp housing supply because of this reason, that reason, that reason, the other reason. But I was on the phone and I was like, this is still a bad idea. Like, I'm glad that you made it relatively ineffective, but like it's still a bad idea. And they were like, oh, but like it's so popular. You know, people are going to love this rent control. A rent control initiative was on the ballot in California, and it lost badly. And that's California. And I think should challenge the presumption that voters are yearning for ineffectual populist economic policies. I mean, maybe they are to some extent, but like what people most want out of economic policy is policies that make their lives better, not policies that don't work. And in this case, it sounds like they don't even want the populist idea conceptually, which like is great, right? I mean, if you can do technocratically sound policy and people want that, and they like the outcome, like that's great. Like let's go do that. But the Biden administration they just didn't do it, and I think it's like in some ways bleedingly obvious, but it's challenging. It's easier inside Democratic Party politics to suggest different economic ideas than to suggest a different approach to social and cultural issues, so people land there.
So questions about the economy, questions about politics. Kavya.
Yeah,
Oh, we have a microphone coming. Then we'll go over here for some
Thanks.
questions.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm really interested in hearing what your take is on sort of the path forward for the Democrats. I think shortly after the election, you tweeted out these 9 points of sort of common sense, path for Democrats. I'm not sure if you've followed some of the response to that on X, but the major criticism of that is those 9 points where you talked about thinking about the working class economically, but still prioritizing growth. And you talked about political correctness in there as well. The criticism is, that is basically Trump's platform. So my question is, do you think there's any merits to that criticism? And, if yes, where do, common sense Democrats differentiate from, Trump's platform?
Sure, I'm editing it, I can't say I read 100% of the critics because I've been here. The point there, though, is actually to narrow the gap, right? It's not to say that the whole platform should be what's there. It's that, like, what makes a Democrat is that, like, we care about, Democrats care about abortion rights. They care a lot about helping poor people. They care a lot about access to health care. They care about protecting Social Security and Medicare. Right? These are, like, Democrat classic ideas. And I think that we're going to see this. I mean, I think the Trump administration is going to try to enact big cuts in income support and health care for low-income and disabled Americans to make their budget math add up. And we're going to have a big fight about that. Democrats are going to be activated and mobilized around these issues. I don't know who will win. I don't know what the congressional math is. But I think the Trump side of those arguments will be very unpopular with people. It's quite cruel. It's something I'm very worried about because I think these ideas may pass. But then issue salience comes and goes, right? And the question is going to be, do we end up back in a position where we are arguing about which books are in school libraries and who plays on which high school sports team. Areas where I think Democrats have adopted, positions that are broadly unpopular, but also that they're specifically unpopular with the kind of working class voters who Democrats want to represent in their economic policy. And I think that ultimately, if you want to do politics that lifts up the vulnerable, you need to cultivate them as constituents. You can't help them despite themselves. And that means you need to do some alignment with sort of normal opinions, I think, on cultural values and basic social order. But here on the economics part, it's some of that is just then coming back to earth on economic issues as well, rather than this epicycles theory where you can have a cultural agenda that people reject and then get them to vote for you anyway because you're participating in what's really an intra-academic feud, pitting left of center economists against further left people, and that there's no mass engagement with these kinds of questions. But people want economic policies that work, and people want social and moral values that they agree with.
Question here and then back there. Yep.
I need the sunrise guy. Come on.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for coming here. Very, very interesting presentation. You kind of talked about how Harris lost because of failings on cultural issues and dissatisfaction with Biden's populist economic policy. In conversations I've had with people who are voting for Trump at Dartmouth, I've heard from a lot of them that people kind of see Harris and Biden as emblematic of this neoliberal kind of status quo, these politicians, and see Trump more as an outsider who's going to shake this up. So you're kind of suggesting a return to this neoliberal economic order, but I'm curious if the election of Trump, does that not represent kind of a rejection of that order and kind of a statement by voters that they actually want something different, given his kind of populist economic policy?
Sure. This is, I keep saying no. I think that this is really wrong, that people vote for Trump because they agree with him primarily about immigration originally. And then this is expanded to problems with inflation under Biden. Lots of other stuff that's kind of there in the mix. I do not believe that people vote for Donald Trump because they want across-the-board 20% tariffs. That is populist in some vague sense, but it's not going to help people. It's going to make their incomes down rather than up. And the number one thing Trump supporters say when you ask them, elite Trump supporters, is don't worry, he's not actually going to do that because it's crazy, and I hope he doesn't do it. So yeah, no. I think this is a tough problem for the Sunrise Movement, which has, enjoys the theory that we can do very aggressive climate policy without any kind of economic trade-offs for people, which is just not true. I personally am actually, despite my fights on the internet, very invested in the climate issue. I swapped out my stove for an induction stove. I drive a hybrid car. I'm going to replace it with an EV. I have solar panels on my rooftop. I have borne a lot of personal expense to try to reduce my carbon footprint. But when you ask people, how much more are you willing to pay in electricity to reduce emissions, it's $10 a year, which is not, that's not enough to achieve these things. And so if we want to achieve more on climate, we need to convince people that they should care more about this than they actually do, rather than deciding that if we throw out economic orthodoxy, we can make this work better. Because if you ask an economist, how should you handle climate change, right? They'll say, well, we should price emissions. Then you ask a political operative about that, and they'll say, well, but people hate that idea. They don't want to pay more for energy, which is, that's bad. That's a bad fact about the world. But if your alternate policy is one that has an even worse cost-benefit ratio, you haven't actually solved anything there. And I feel on climate, that's the kind of loop that Democrats have gotten stuck in, that they've taken an idea that people don't want and they've tried to replace it with other ideas that are even worse. And you got to do the other thing and like either persuade people that your good idea is good or come up with ideas that are less costly.
Question right behind, and then over here.
Thank you so much for coming. And first, I think one thing that I really appreciated from your talk was your discussion of the 2014 immigration decision. I think most of the students in this room are in middle school, and we definitely do not think a lot about how that changed the course of our current politics. So I really thought that was incredibly compelling. Something that I'm sort of questioning you on, though, and maybe this is because I do listen to a lot more Ezra Klein, is your position on the economy. So I think a few like salient facts is that I agree that this is sloppy and unprincipled economic policy, as you say, but this all does have roots in the Trump era, right? He's a real estate guy. He's the one who pushed for low interest rates to begin with, trying to control the Fed. Then we have the biggest supply shock since 1973, right? This massive disruption. You can say that arguably Biden did an incredible job, right? Income inequality is at pretty much it's low for the past 30 years. We have rising real wages. I don't really understand what incentive either party would have to return to neoliberalism, right? I agree that if Trump institutes all of these tariffs, it's going to cause, it's ridiculous, it's terrible economic policy. But if he's pulled back from the edge to a certain extent and can continue the good economy that Biden has started, why would the Democrats ever turn to an economic set of policies that caused income inequality to rise so much in the aftermath of the recession? Like, I agree that this economics is bad, but I don't know why neoliberalism would be a good political answer.
Sure. I mean, again, I don't want to say that more neoliberal, more technocratic economics is the answer to Democrats' problems. Like what I'm saying is that the answer to Democrats' problems is more moderate cultural politics. Separately, if you win elections, you do have to run the government and make public policy decisions. And so, for example, if you're saying, well, one issue that people are struggling with is the high cost of housing, right? Well, so we should address that with public policy. The Biden administration, to its credit, has correctly identified local zoning rules as a big problem for housing costs and has some ideas about how to sort of address those. But they did also put forward this rent control proposal that would make things worse rather than better. But they've also done all kinds of things outside of the housing silo. So like one thing that they've done, I think their third round of higher tariffs on imported Canadian lumber came down a couple months ago. And like, why are you making construction materials more expensive if you're also doing rent control? It's like this like grasping at straws. They have changed the, I forget what it's called. They've changed the Davis-Bacon rules to like further increase the pay of construction workers in a way that raises prices. They talk they brag all the time about the increase in factory construction that is happening under Biden and that they've spent a lot of money to make happen. What happens if you spend money to overbid home builders for construction labor so that they can go work on factories is that the housing supply gets diminished. Some of that they say, well, we're doing this for national security reasons, right? Like, we need to build this chips thing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's fine. But if you have a national security initiative, right? I mean, if a general comes to you, he's like, sir, like, we need to build more airplanes. You say, well, I don't know. Like, that sounds expensive, right? Like, that's on the cost side of the ledger. And then he has to make the argument to you, like, well, we need the fighter jets. And so you say, well, is there a way we can make the fighter jets more quickly, more cheaply? Can we import them from Korea? Like, what can we do? It's on, because the benefit is security, the cost is the construction. Biden keeps portraying the costs of his strategic competition with China as benefits, and then being confused as to why housing construction is down. So like, the Taiwanese at one point wanted to bring Taiwanese workers over to build the chip factory. And the Biden administration told them, no, you can't do that. You need to retrain American workers to build the chip factory, because they wanted to tout the job creation benefits. But like, why? Like, it would have gotten built faster and cheaper if they'd let the Taiwanese do it. Now, I'm not going to say it would be crazy to be like, people voted for Trump because of this incredibly obscure decision about immigrant construction workers. But it's like, these decisions add up, right? Like, especially if you're in an inflationary environment, you want to try to make decisions that make sense and that minimize the costs of what you're doing. And then on politics, like macro politics, you got to say stuff people agree with about like the big, like criminals are bad. I'm against that. I'm not like hyper concerned with making sure that they're treated better. I don't know.
We got a question right here, and then over here.
Hello. My question is, how does Trump's promise to deliver tariffs differ from the Biden administration's rent controls and such economic interventions? And how do you feel the public reaction under Trump will be different to the negative effects of obviously what Biden did?
Well, I mean, Biden didn't actually do this rent control thing. He just floated it as an idea. So the American political system has way more veto points in it than most countries do. And one consequence of that is that, a president can always like put forward policy ideas that he knows are DOA in Congress and then tell different people, like, don't worry about it, it's not gonna happen. What's unique about the tariffs is that the president has incredible amount of discretionary authority over this. So nothing is stopping Trump from imposing 10% across the board tariff. Maybe, I mean, it might get litigated, but most people think he just can do this, whether Congress agrees or not. And so, the question will be like, just does he follow through on his platform or does he not? And if there's an adverse market reaction, does that cause him to back down? I think people are gonna be pretty upset if, random stuff they buy starts getting more expensive. And I also don't think, some of this, right? I mean, people like jobs. I like jobs, everybody likes jobs. Certain kinds of industries, like we're manufacturing high-end semiconductors, that like sounds cool, right? But we're gonna have people making socks in a sweatshop because we don't import them from Bangladesh. Like that's not like the future people want for their kids. We're gonna put higher prices on coffee and bananas, which we just don't grow in the United States, or after we deport all the immigrants, you guys are gonna have job opportunities picking fruit. Like it actually doesn't make sense as an economic policy. I think in like a really gut level way, which is separate from the guys who work in the auto industry don't want to be put under by competition from China, which, the economics of that are the economics, but like you understand the politics perfectly well of why people in incumbent industries want trade protection. But, we live in a big global economy. There's lots of stuff that we import that's just wholly made abroad, and there's no reason to try to tax it.
We have a question down here, and then we'll go back over here and here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I have a quick question about what do you think Harris could have done differently if she read your tweet or Substack in April? Because I think she has put some sort of effort to try to be more moderate on cultural policies. Like she made some weird comments about her being pro-gun, and then also the immigration bill that ended up failing. I can go on.
Yeah, I mean, she absolutely made some effort to, she in particular made an effort to distance herself from some of her own positions from 2019. But there's a long roster of, so she mentioned that she owns a gun, which I think was good. But, did she pushed for a national assault weapons ban, which does very poorly. I mean, they did a referendum on that in Maine, which is, she won Maine. That's a left of center state. Failed there. I don't know why you push that, why you say, well, on the one hand, we're in like a twilight struggle for the future of democracy, but also I'm pushing a gun regulation that people don't even want. In her old book, Smart on Crime, which I think is a quite good book, she really like takes to task leftists who would tell her that it's racist to have policing. She says I go to low-income black neighborhoods and people want police on the streets, et cetera. She didn't articulate those kind of viewpoints. She said she was for the border bill. She kept getting asked how do you differ with Biden? it just seemed like the most obvious answer in the world to give would have been to say he was way too slow to act on these border security issues. I don't know why she didn't say that. I mean, maybe people in the White House have her on record as saying, I don't know what happened, right? So we can play like fantasy baseball with politics and be like, she should have said this, she should have said that. But I think that there was a recognition that there was vulnerabilities in those spaces, but still incredible conservatism about how you address that relative to the way that, say, Bill Clinton very assertively tried to paint himself as moderate on certain kinds of social and cultural issues. Obama, a little bit of a more complex situation, but he in the 2008 campaign, he talked about how he supports diversity in institutions, but he also doesn't think it totally makes sense to say that the daughters of a United States senator need to be given advantages over a low-income white person in college applications. That was like a spicy take. People took note of that and were like, this is like a refreshing, attitude from a Democrat. And he did way better with poor white people than any of the post-Obama candidates have done. I think because he specifically aligned with reasons a low-income white person might feel that contemporary progressives are not listening to them and don't care about their problems. He was like, I get it, I see it, and his successors haven't done anything like that.
A question in the back there, and then we'll move over on this side.
I wanted to ask you about some of her changes in her position and the fact that she did not sufficiently explain why she moved on. That could be anything from immigration to the unrealized gains tax. This is common criticism of people like Sam Harris or Andrew Sullivan, that she had opportunities to do that and she chose not to. Do you think that had an effect on her performance in these 7 swing states?
Again, it's hard to say, right? Like, well, okay, a better appearance would have done this, but I also took note of that, right? That there's no shame, I think, in changing positions on certain kinds of things, but you expect to hear some kind of explanation of why somebody changed their mind. I don't think it would have even been that hard, particularly on fracking and immigration topics, to talk about how the situation had changed over time since she had said those things. That at the height of the Trump child separation controversy, this idea became floated that we needed to repeal these kind of criminal penalties that were being used as a lever to enact a very cruel policy. So I said, yeah, like we should stop that. But if I'm president, I'm just not going to do that. Right? And we have also had this huge influx of asylum seekers, and it would send a terrible signal to be rolling back immigration laws. So, like, this is where I am. And I told Joe 2 years ago, like, we got to, but again, it's like we can all game out, like, what she, quote unquote, should have said about these things. But then the question is like, what like, would have been true, or at least credibly true? Like, what could you convey to explain these kind of things? And, like it's both not good that she didn't have compelling, detailed explanations, but I also think it was telling that she didn't put herself in many positions where people could ask her about those kind of things. I don't know what's up with that, but she acted like somebody who did not want to have extended, unstructured conversations about American politics and society. Traditionally, we have presidents who do more of that, or like Trump, have like worn us down with bluster, so that nobody like expects Trump to give like a good explanation of what his healthcare policy is. And that hurts him too. If Trump was like articulate and well-informed, he would do better. So it's not like impossible to win without being articulate and well-informed, but it would definitely help.
Question in the back there, yep.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I study public opinion, so my question is more on that front when you talk about like this moderation on social issues. And I was actually talking about this with a Republican friend this morning. Like in 2016, you know, like Pat McCrory lost in North Carolina despite the fact that Trump was winning the state.
Yeah.
And that was because of trans issues, right?
Absolutely.
So he signed the bathroom ban, and that was really, really unpopular. And then like, you know, and just in the public opinion polling, you know, trans issues were more popular 2016 to 2020, immigration, like the current things that we see on mass deportation, on path to citizenship, the negative stuff, that's like a last 2-3 years thing. That's not really, you know, that wasn't like, I'm struggling to see somewhat like things were different in 2016 with the way people felt about these issues. And I wonder what you have to say about that, and also like the impact of messaging and communication on the Democratic side as a way of like changing people's views on these issues, because I personally think that Republicans do a better job of manufacturing outrage on this stuff, and it does change people's views in a way that evidently mattered this year.
Well, I mean, you know, we should have a detailed conversation about this sometime, but, you know, as you said, like, people's views have changed since 2016, and also Trump is much more popular than he was in 2016, right? I mean, in 2016, Hillary came like this close to winning, right? Whereas Harris came like this close to winning. So you wouldn't have needed to be very different than Hillary to win. But I do think that, you know, her stances on immigration, criminal justice, I don't think trans issues were live in any real way in 2016, but that's why I centered immigration and crime as issues that, you know, pushed white working class voters away from her at that point. I mean, simple index of this is in 2004, police union endorses John Kerry. In 2008, police union endorses Barack Obama. In 2012, no police union endorsement. 2016, police union strongly endorses Trump, right? People like cops. You know, the union has some money, it has the actual votes of its members, but also like, the police say this person will keep you safe. Like, that's powerful signaling. Democrats by 2016 were not in a position to work for the support of law enforcement professionals and their institutions. And I think that's narrowly costly in a narrow election. The question of public opinion plasticity is much too complicated to discuss here. It's an important question. Like, how does long-term social change occur? That's like above my pay grade.
We had a last question right in the back there. Yep. Sorry.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for coming and joining us. I think we're all very honored that you chose to be here right after the election. So thank you.
You got to wait for the Harry Enton. He has like the actual information you guys want.
All right. I was wondering, so you spoke to us about how Democrats need to be more aligned on cultural issues with the mainstream and offer sound technocratic economic policy. I'm wondering, what do you think this election taught us about where Democrats should stand on foreign policy? In particular, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where Democrats might want to stand on both Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine in the light of what we saw in this election.
You know, foreign policy is always like really low salience to voters. It's a really paradoxical thing because foreign policy issues have really high prestige in the media. If you look at like the share of front page articles that went before Gaza, there was Ukraine. Before Ukraine, there was Afghanistan withdrawal. National security issues just always get tons and tons and tons of media play. And then you ask voters, like, what do you care about? And it'll be like 29th about something, you know? And so when people are really fired up, at the peak of the Campus Gaza protests, Israel-Palestine ranked, I think, 11th among under 30 people, which was really high, like, to be clear, for a foreign policy topic. So if I'm just like doing political strategy, I would not sweat foreign policy, like, at all. These are very substantively important issues, like very literally life or death for thousands of people, which is also another reason, right? When you're talking about like, what do you play politics with? Like you know, there's a calculus of like how much do the voters care and like how much does it matter in the real world. Foreign policy is like matters a lot in the real world and like not that much to voters. I cannot solve the Israel-Palestine conflict for you here tonight, but it's like you should just like try to do something good on that subject that like works, and you probably won't get any credit for voters from it anyway. But it would still be a good idea.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but if you want to come down and introduce yourself, ask a question, please come up. Thank you so much for visiting campus.
Thank you.
today.
Every day. Thank you.